The sign had been there for 11 days before Nora Calloway saw it. She almost missed it entirely. The highway into Faith ran straight and flat the way most roads in western South Dakota ran, as if the land itself had decided that curves were a waste of effort. She had been watching the grass along the shoulder, a habit she had developed during 4 years at university, when she began noticing things other people drove past without seeing. The grass was already thinning in late March. Not unusual for this time of year, but the thinning felt different now, drier and more desperate than she remembered from her childhood. There was a brittleness in the color of it, a faded quality that belonged to late summer rather than early spring, as though the land had skipped a season and gone straight to surrender. Then she turned down the county road toward home, and there it was. A for sale sign, white with red letters planted at the edge of the gravel lane leading up to the Calloway ranch house. Nora pressed the brake pedal and sat with the engine running. The late afternoon sun threw long orange light across the prairie. The sign was not new. The edges were already beginning to gray from exposure to the cold, and the stake had settled into the ground at the slight lean of something that had been standing for a while. Someone had planted it at least a week ago, maybe more. The words were precise and businesslike. Property for sale. Contact Agricor Land Services. A phone number below, printed in the clean font of a company that had done this many times before. She had not called home during the last 2 weeks of the semester. There had been exams, and her advisor had scheduled a final review meeting the same week she was supposed to leave, and she had told herself her mother was managing fine. Winifred Calloway had always been practical. She had always been capable. Nora had believed that. She had believed it so thoroughly that she had let the belief substitute for attention. And now she sat in the gravel lane in the late afternoon light, looking at a sign that had been standing long enough to start weathering, and she understood what inattention had cost her. She pulled the truck slowly up the lane and parked beside the old cottonwood tree near the house. The branches were still bare. The yard looked quieter than she remembered, smaller somehow, like something had already begun to leave before she arrived to notice it. Winifred was at the kitchen table when Nora pushed open the screen door. The smell of the house was exactly the same as it had always been, old wood and coffee, in the faint sweetness of dried prairie flowers her mother kept in a clay jar near the window. Flowers that had been there so long they had lost their color, but kept their shape. But the papers spread across the table were not familiar. Nora recognized the format before she could read the words. Legal documents, multiple pages, a notary stamp on the lower corner of the first sheet. Her mother looked up. Something moved across Winifred's face, not guilt exactly, but the careful expression of a woman who had rehearsed a conversation many times and still was not sure how to begin it, who had imagined this moment and found that imagination had not adequately prepared her for the reality of her daughter standing in the doorway, with road dust on her jacket, and the particular stillness of someone who has just understood something they were not prepared to understand. "When did you put the sign up?" Nora asked. Winifred set down her coffee. 2 weeks ago. I was going to call you after the semester." Nora pulled out the nearest chair and sat down without taking off her coat. She reached across the table and turned the first page of the document toward her. The buyer was listed as Agricor Land Services, a subsidiary of a larger agricultural investment firm based in Rapid City. The purchase price covered the full outstanding debt on the ranch, the mortgage balance, the equipment loans, and the unpaid property taxes, with a remaining balance that would leave Winifred Calloway with enough to start over somewhere smaller. Somewhere without 3 years of accumulated drought damage. Somewhere without the weight of a ranch that had slowly been losing ground since Heartland Calloway died. Nora read the document carefully. She turned each page with the deliberate patience she had learned in university, the habit of reading everything before reacting to any of it, a habit she had developed partly from Professor Aubrey Wentworth, who had told his students on the first day of his rangeland ecology seminar that the most expensive mistakes in land management were always made by people who reacted before they had finished reading. Most of it was standard language, property description, transaction timeline, transfer of all structures and equipment, and improvements. She read through the sections on easements and water rights and the representations made by each party, and she was beginning to think the document was what it appeared to be, which was a straightforward sale of a struggling ranch, when she reached page 7. Buried in the subsection covering mineral and resource rights was a single paragraph that did not look, at first glance, substantially different from the paragraphs around it. It authorized Agricor, or any future subsidiary of Agricor, to conduct exploratory surveys and subsequent extraction operations regarding any subsurface mineral or energy resources identified within the property boundaries for a period of up to 10 years following the date of acquisition. The language was dense and technical, deliberately so, the kind of language that lawyers spent their careers perfecting precisely because it needed to be present in the document without drawing attention to itself. It was designed for people focused on the numbers at the top of the page to look past, and it had almost worked. Nora read the paragraph twice. She read it a third time to make sure she had parsed it correctly. Then she set the document down. "Did you read all of this?" she asked. Winifred frowned. Boyd explained the main points. Boyd Stanner. He's the representative from Agricor. He came out twice. He was very thorough. Nora turned the document back toward her mother and placed her finger on the paragraph. Winifred leaned forward and read. Her expression did not change immediately, but after a moment she straightened in her chair with the particular stillness that meant she was recalibrating, absorbing new information against the architecture of decisions she had already begun to construct. "He never mentioned that," Winifred said quietly. "No," Nora agreed. "I imagine he didn't." The screen door opened before either of them could continue. Harriet Voss came through it the way she always had, with a knock that was more announcement than request, carrying a covered dish and moving with the confident authority of someone who had been dropping by this kitchen for 30 years. Harriet was 60 years old, wide-shouldered, with short silver hair cut close, and the kind of deep tan that came from decades of prairie sun and did not fade in winter. She had been the Callaways' nearest neighbor since before Nora was born, and she had been Winifred's closest friend since Harlan's funeral. The person who had sat at the same table through those first terrible weeks and said very little and stayed very long. She set the dish on the counter, pulled off her coat, and then noticed the papers on the table. She noticed Nora's face. She noticed Winifred's silence. The arithmetic of the room was not complicated. "I brought a casserole," Harriet said carefully. "Sit down, Harriet," Winifred said. Harriet sat. She looked at the document and then looked at Nora. And then she said the thing that changed the temperature of the room entirely. "You should know that Boyd Stanner stopped by the Hendersons last week, and the Bruckner place the week before that. And I heard he's been talking to 2 other families east of town, the Dills and the Morys." She paused. "He doesn't just want your place, Winifred. He wants the whole corridor running from the highway to the ridge." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the bare cottonwood branches with the low sound of something patient and indifferent. Nora thought about the mineral rights clause on page 7. She thought about a man who wanted a connected corridor of land running along the same geological formation, 5 adjacent properties, a strip of prairie stretching from the highway to the ridge. She thought about what you could do with 5 such properties if you were not actually interested in raising cattle on any of them. If the cattle and the grass and the ranch houses and the families were simply the surface arrangement of a different kind of transaction entirely. The transaction on page 7. She looked at her mother. "Don't sign it," Nora said. "Not yet. Give me a chance to show you something else." Winifred did not answer immediately. She looked out the window toward the pastures. The grass was dead and gray, and the fence posts leaned at tired angles. The ranch looked exactly like what it was, a place that had been fighting for 3 years and was beginning to lose that fight by inches, by seasons, by the slow mathematics of more going out than coming in, with no clear way to reverse the direction. "Nora," Winifred said finally, We have been losing money since your father died. Every year. We have cut expenses and we have sold cattle and we have done everything a person is supposed to do when a ranch is struggling. And we are still losing. I know. The bank called last week. Orrin Flagg himself. Not one of the loan officers. Orrin. Winifred's voice remained even, but Nora heard the exhaustion beneath it. The particular exhaustion that comes not from physical labor, but from years of managing fear quietly, of waking up every morning and deciding to keep going rather than to stop. He said if we do not make a significant payment against the principal by October, the bank will begin formal proceedings. I know that too. Winifred looked at her daughter with the expression of a woman who had been waiting a long time for someone to give her a reason to change her mind, and was not yet sure whether she was looking at that reason now. Then tell me what I don't know. Nora unzipped her bag and set it on the table beside the legal documents. She had carried the bag from Brookings to Faith without checking its contents, but she knew exactly what was in it. She pulled out a rolled set of maps, soil surveys from 3 different research stations, a folder of academic papers with their margins annotated in the cramped handwriting she had developed over 4 years of taking notes she could not afford to lose, and a notebook filled with handwritten calculations she had completed during the final months of the semester, cross-referencing drought cycle data from the Great Plains against water retention measurements from native prairie restoration projects in Nebraska and Wyoming and Kansas. She spread the maps across the table directly on top of the AgriCorps contract. The image was almost too deliberate to be accidental. 4 years of science sitting on top of a company's money. We have been managing this land the way everyone manages land around here, Nora said. Cattle rotation, hay repeat. It worked for 30 years. It stopped working because the land is exhausted. The topsoil is compacted from decades of the same kind of traffic. The native grasses are gone, replaced by species with shallow roots that cannot access moisture below the surface. When it doesn't rain enough, there is nothing left to hold moisture deep enough to matter. Nothing left to feed the roots. Nothing left to keep the soil biologically alive. Winifred watched her. But the land is not dead, Nora continued. It is depleted. Those are different conditions, and the difference matters enormously because depleted land can recover and dead land cannot. The mechanisms for recovery are already present in the soil. They are dormant, suppressed, waiting for the conditions that would allow them to function again. She placed her finger on the first map, tracing the contour lines of the eastern pasture. Big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, native prairie species with root systems that push 6, 8, 10 feet into the ground. They were here before the cattle ranches came. They are the reason this prairie survived 15,000 years of drought cycles, cycles far worse than anything we have seen in the past 3 years. The deep roots access moisture that surface grasses cannot reach. The root mass holds the topsoil together against erosion. The organic matter in the root systems feeds the microbial life that keeps the soil absorbing water instead of shedding it. She moved her finger to the second document, a photograph she had printed from a university research paper. The image blurry from being enlarged too many times, but still recognizable. And the animal that built this ecosystem, that grazed it in a specific way for thousands of years, that kept it alive and expanding and self-renewing. Winifred looked at the photograph. Bison, American bison, not as a permanent replacement for everything we have built here. As a start, a managed herd carefully rotated. They graze differently than cattle in ways that turn out to be critical for recovery. They move constantly. They never remain in one area long enough to strip it bare. They trample the soil in patterns that break surface compaction without destroying root systems. Their grazing stimulates the native grasses in ways that cattle grazing does not. Their waste integrates into the soil differently, and when the native grasses start coming back around them, the roots go down and the soil starts holding water again, and the land begins to feed itself instead of depending on us to feed it. Winifred was quiet for a long time. She looked at the maps, in the papers, in the photograph. She looked at the AgriCorps contract half buried beneath them. She looked at her daughter. It takes time, Nora admitted. Not 30 years, but not 6 months either. The changes happen underground, first invisibly, and by the time they become visible above ground, they are already well established. That is the nature of it. We do not have 3 years, Nora. I know that, but give me one. 1 year before you sign anything. Let me show you what the land can do with 1 year of the right conditions. The screen door tested its latch in the wind. They both looked up, and then Winifred looked back at her daughter. Where would you even find bison? Nora had prepared for this question since November, sitting in her dormitory room in Brookings, reading correspondence from a rancher in the western part of the state who had been rebuilding something that people said could not be rebuilt. His name is Chester Ironwood. He is Lakota, from a family whose land sits west of here near the Cheyenne River. He has been raising bison on his family's property for 20 years, since long before it became fashionable to talk about prairie restoration. He knows this land the way nobody trained at a university knows it, because his family has been part of this land for generations, beyond counting. I have been writing to him for a year. He is willing to sell us a starter herd at a fair price. Winifred picked up one of the academic papers and looked at it without quite reading it. And our cattle, we sell most of them. That money pays for the bison and covers the first season of transition costs. The sound that came from Winifred Calloway was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. It was something quieter than either the sound of a woman setting down one calculation and picking up a different one. She set the paper down. She looked at the map. She looked at the AgriCorps contract beneath it. 1 year, she said. 1 year. Winifred's hands rested flat on the table. She looked at her daughter for a long time the way she had always looked at Nora before making a decision, as though she were reading something in her face that words alone could not communicate. Don't make me regret this, she said. The news moved across Meade County the way most news did in that part of South Dakota, by word of mouth at the feed store and the livestock auction and the parking lot of the Lutheran church on Sunday mornings. Within 2 weeks, the version that reached most people had lost most of its accuracy and gained several flourishes that no one could trace to a source. Nora Calloway was turning the ranch into a wildlife preserve funded by California environmentalists. Nora Calloway had studied too many books at college and come home to ruin what her father had spent his life building. Nora Calloway was about to discover that the real world did not work the way university classrooms said it did. Nora ignored the variations. She had work to do. The first practical problem was the cattle. 70% of the remaining herd needed to go to market before she could fund the bison purchase and cover the first month of operating changes she planned to make. She loaded the first trailer on a Thursday morning in early April, working alone in the pre-dawn cold. The cold had a particular quality that morning, clean and absolute, and she worked in it without fighting it the way a person works in weather they have known all their life. Weather that is part of the context rather than an obstacle. By the time she pulled into Faith for the livestock auction, the sun had barely cleared the horizon. The yard was crowded. The last weeks of March and 1st of April were always busy ranchers sorting their herds before the season set in. She recognized most of the trucks in the lot. She had grown up knowing whose truck was whose, could place a vehicle by its dense and its particular shade of faded color, the way other people recognize faces. Vic Prudhoe was near the coffee table by the auctioneer's office when Nora walked in. Vic was 55 broad through the chest and neck, with a gray mustache and the kind of permanently weathered skin that came from decades under the same unforgiving sky. He had hands that looked like they had been shaped by wire and fence posts and cold metal for 30 years. He was not a malicious man. Nora had always understood that, had understood it even as a child, watching him talk with her father at county meetings. He was simply a man who had been right about most things for most of his life, and had arrived at an age where being wrong felt less like a learning experience and more like a personal indictment. He watched her unload the trailer with the particular attention of someone who has already formed an opinion and is watching events for confirmation rather than information. Then he walked over, with a cup of coffee in one hand and the easy grin of a man who already knew what he was going to say. "Heard you're buying buffalo." Nora continued working the trailer gate. "Bison, that's what I said." Two of the ranchers near the fence chuckled. She recognized them both. They had known her father since before she was born, had eaten at her parents' table during county gatherings, and shaken Harlan Calloway's hand at every harvest. They watched her now with the comfortable amusement of people who had already decided how the story ended. "You know what happens when a rancher around here stops raising cattle?" Vic asked loud enough to carry across the yard. Nora looked at him directly. "No, what happens? They go broke." The laughter that followed was not cruel. That almost made it worse. It was the laughter of people who were not trying to be unkind, just certain, the easy laughter of a consensus that has not yet been tested by the thing it is dismissing. She felt the pressure of it building beneath her ribs. She had rehearsed this moment many times in her head, had prepared arguments, had sources and data, and peer-reviewed research from 3 universities. She knew the root depth of Big Bluestem down to the inch. She knew the water retention differential between native prairie and degraded pasture under drought conditions. She knew the drought cycles of the Great Plains going back 1,000 years from ice core samples and sediment records and the field journals of 19th century surveyors. Professor Aubrey Wentworth had told her once, in the flat tones of a man who had spent 30 years watching students make the same mistake, that people who spent all their energy arguing rarely had enough left to prove their point. The argument and the proof competed for the same finite resource, and you had to choose which one you were willing to sacrifice, because you almost never had enough of both. She smiled at Vic Prudhoe. "We'll see." She saw something shift in his expression. Not respect and not agreement, just the slight displacement of a man who had expected a different response and found that the absence of the expected response left him momentarily without a next step. She turned back to the trailer. The meeting with Orrin Flagg happened the same morning, which Nora had not planned for, and would later recognize as either terrible timing or exactly the information she needed when she needed it. Flagg was at the auction for reasons of his own, and he intercepted her near the main gate as she was preparing to leave. He was 61, compact and precise, in the way of a man who had spent decades managing other people's risk and had become fluent in the language of outcomes. He wore a gray wool jacket with the collar turned up against the cold, and he shook her hand with the firm economy of someone whose handshakes were professional assessments rather than social gestures. "I heard you were back," he said. "Good. Your mother needs the support." "I'm doing more than supporting," Nora said. Flagg looked at her steadily, measuring something that was not in her face so much as in the way she was standing. "I know what you're planning." "Then you know it's a long-term approach." "I know it's described as a long-term approach." He paused. "Nora, I knew your father for 20 years. I respected him. What I'm about to say, I'm saying because of that, not in spite of it." He held her gaze with the directness of a man who had learned that hesitation costs more than bluntness. "I cannot modify your loan terms based on a theory about grass and soil. The bank does not lend against ecosystem recovery timelines. It lends against income, against assets, against demonstrated capacity to service debt. Those are not bureaucratic preferences. They are the conditions under which other people's savings are protected." He paused again, and in the pause she heard the genuine difficulty of a man who was about to say something true that he would have preferred not to have to say. "You have 6 months before the board initiates formal review. Not because I want that outcome, because that is where the math leads if nothing changes." He was not threatening her. That was the most difficult thing about Orrin Flagg. He was simply telling her the truth in the plainest language available. And there was no argument to be made against the truth itself, only against the conclusions you drew from it. And even those arguments had to begin from an honest acknowledgement of the truth. "I understand," she said. "I hope so." He nodded with the finality of a man who had said what he came to say and walked on. She stood in the auction yard for a moment with the sounds of livestock and engines and cold air around her. 6 months to show numbers, Not maps, not research papers, not the elegant logic of a rangeland ecology thesis. Numbers that could be entered into a bank's accounting system and produce a different result from the one the current numbers produced. She drove home slower than she had driven out. Chester Ironwood arrived on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later, pulling a large livestock trailer behind a truck that had clearly spent decades on unpaved roads. He was 62, lean, and long-limbed with silver-black hair tied back at the base of his neck, and a face shaped by decades of weather and the kind of patience that comes from understanding that most things worth waiting for require more time than impatience can tolerate. He moved with the economy of motion that Nora associated with people who had spent their lives around large animals, never hurrying, never performing, simply moving from one thing to the next with the efficiency of someone who had long since stopped needing to demonstrate that they knew what they were doing. He stepped down from the truck and looked at the Callaway Ranch the way a doctor looks at a patient before speaking, taking inventory, reading signs, forming a picture that words had not yet assembled. "You're Nora." "I am." "Your letters were good." Clear thinking. He looked toward the pastures, reading them the way she had learned to read documents. "The land looks tired." "It is. It can come back." He said it the way he might have said the weather will change, not as a hope or a reassurance, as a fact about how things worked, a fact that did not require anyone's belief to remain true. They walked the property together before he unloaded the bison. Chester asked questions that surprised her, not about her plans or her data, about her father, about how Harlan Callaway had managed the eastern section in wet years versus dry years, about where the original fence lines had run before the property was reconfigured in the 1980s, about which parts of the land Harlan had considered most productive, and which parts he had always struggled with, and why. She answered every question as fully as she could, and the walking helped her see the land differently, the way she had learned to understand it in research papers, but had not yet practiced looking at it in person, alongside someone else whose looking was informed by a completely different kind of knowledge. They stood together at the northeast corner for several minutes. Chester pushed a boot heel into the soil and looked at what came back. He pulled a stem of dry grass from the ground, held it up, examined the root end. 2 years, he said. Maybe 2.5. After that, you'll start seeing numbers that would mean something to someone who doesn't already understand what you're doing. He dropped the stem. The hard part is holding on until the land can speak for itself. That evening, after the bison had been unloaded and the animals had moved slowly and magnificently into the tall grass of the eastern pasture, pausing at the threshold as large animals pause when they sense something they have not experienced, but somehow recognize in the way that memory can live in the body without living in the mind. Chester sat at the Callaway kitchen table. The fire in the old iron stove made the room warm in the particular way that iron stoves make rooms warm, from the center outward, a warmth that feels earned rather than mechanical. Chester set his cup down and looked at Nora with the directness she had already come to recognize as his version of consideration. "I should tell you something," he said. "I have been sitting with it since you first wrote to me, deciding whether it was mine to share." She waited. "Your father contacted me. Not recently, 5 years before he passed." Chester folded his hands around his cup. "He wrote a letter asking about bison, asking about the old prairie grasses, the ones that were here before the cattle operations came, asking whether a ranch of this size could make the transition back to something closer to what the land had been before it was managed for beef." He paused. He never followed through. "I wrote back and he went quiet. I don't know why exactly. Maybe the timing was wrong. Maybe the debt felt too heavy to take on a new kind of risk on top of it. Maybe he needed someone alongside him and didn't have that person." The kitchen was quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when something true has just been said and the people in the room need a moment to let it settle. "He knew," Nora said finally. "He saw the same thing you see. He just needed more time to trust it, and he ran out of time before the trust caught up with the vision." Winifred had not moved. Nora looked at her mother and saw something working behind her eyes. some recalculation happening at a depth that the ordinary surface of Winifred's expression could not quite contain. She was a woman who had spent 3 years managing grief by managing forward, by making decisions and filling in forms and maintaining the momentum of practical necessity. And here was a piece of her husband she had not known, a piece that connected directly to the thing her daughter was trying to do. And it was finding its way into her understanding and changing the shape of something there that had been set in a different configuration. That night, after Chester had gone to sleep in the spare room and Winifred had retreated upstairs, Nora went outside with Hatch. The old border collie was 11 slow on cold mornings, with white fur spreading across his muzzle and a cloudiness beginning in his dark eyes that had not been there a year ago. He had been Harlan Calloway's dog for the first 7 years of his life, had followed Harlan through pastures and cattle pens and the particular rhythms of a rancher's day with the absolute devotion of an animal that has found its purpose. And he had transferred that devotion to Nora after Harlan died with a completeness that seemed to require no adjustment period at all, as though loyalty at a certain depth does not attach to a person so much as to the place and the work and the life that person represented. They walked to the eastern pasture fence. Through the dark she could hear the bison, not see them, only hear the low sounds of their movement through the grass, the heavy breathing of large animals settling into a new place, finding the familiar in the unfamiliar, the way all creatures do when the place they have been put is the place they were made for. Nora stood at the fence for a long time. The deadline Orrin Flagg had given her ran forward in her mind like a measuring tape being pulled across rough ground. 6 months to show demonstrable financial improvement, not full recovery, just evidence, just enough to satisfy the arithmetic that governed what a bank could and could not do with the money it held on behalf of other people. She had bison on depleted land. She had a neighbor who had laughed at her that morning in front of a crowd. She had a bank with a calendar. She had a man from a land company who had buried a mineral rights clause on page 7 of a contract and was currently working his way through every struggling ranch in the county with the same patient professionalism. She had her father's notebooks in the barn, 30 years of observations about this exact land in this exact climate, notes that she had begun reading 2 evenings ago, and that felt in a way she could not fully articulate, like a conversation she was somehow still able to have. She had a plan. Hatch pressed his warm side against her leg. The prairie was dark and cold and very large in every direction. But somewhere in the eastern pasture, 12 animals that had not stood on this land in more than a century were settling into the grass, and the grass was already beginning to change beneath their feet in ways that no human eye could yet detect, beginning the slow and invisible work of remembering what it had been. Nora put her hand on the old dog's back. "All right," she said quietly. Not to the dog, not entirely to herself. To the land maybe, to her father somewhere in it, to something she could not see but had decided, standing here in the dark, with the sound of bison breathing in the pasture behind her, to trust. 3 days later, Boyd Stanner's silver sedan turned up the gravel lane. She was repairing the south fence when she heard the engine. She recognized the car before she recognized the man, the same vehicle she had seen parked here the day she arrived home. He stepped out wearing clean trousers and a jacket that was expensive without calling attention to itself. And he walked toward her with the patience of a man who had learned that patience was a more effective tool than pressure in the particular kind of negotiation where one party had money and the other party had a problem. "Ms. Calloway," he offered his hand. She shook it. "I understand your family has decided not to move forward with our offer at this time. My mother hasn't made a final decision." "Of course." He smiled in the professional way of someone who understood exactly what that sentence meant and what it did not mean. "I simply wanted you to know that our offer remains open. 90 days from the original conversation. If circumstances change, the price stays the same." He looked past her toward the eastern pasture where the bison had moved into the taller grass near the ridgeline, their dark shapes moving slowly through the brown and gray of the early spring landscape. "Interesting choice," he said. The way a doctor says interesting when they mean something specific by it. We think so. I'm sure you do. He paused just long enough to convey that the pause was intentional rather than conversational. The offer is there if you need it. He got back in the car and drove down the lane at the same unhurried speed at which he had arrived. Nora watched the car until it reached the county road. Then she turned back to the fence, drove a new post into the ground with even strokes, and kept working. 3 months after the Bison arrived, Dwight Sable drove out to the Callaway Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 4 hours walking the eastern pasture without saying much. Nora walked beside him and did not press. She had learned within the first hour of meeting him that silence from Dwight Sable was not disinterest. He was a county soil conservation technician, 34 years old, tall and angular, with sandy hair and the habit of moving through a landscape the way someone moves through a document, reading it systematically before drawing any conclusions. He had the particular quality of a person who had been underestimated enough times to have stopped feeling the need to announce what he was thinking before he had finished thinking it. He stopped at the northeast corner near the monitoring post Nora had installed in April. He crouched and pushed a steel probe into the soil, watching the depth marker as it descended. He pulled it out, pushed it in again 2 feet to the left. He frowned at the probe with the frown of someone who has found a number that does not match the number they expected to find. He wrote something in his notebook, the careful shorthand of a man who trusted precision over impression. Then he looked up at her. 15%, he said. Moisture retention. Compared to my baseline measurement from April, in the same location. He looked back at the probe mark. That is not what I expected to find after 3 months. What did you expect? Dwight stood slowly. Honestly, I expected to come out here and find an interesting failure, something worth documenting as a case study in what happens when ambitious theory meets difficult conditions. The kind of thing that teaches the next person what not to do. He looked across the pasture where the tall native grasses were already thickening into something that looked less like an abandoned field and more like something older and deliberate, something that had been interrupted and was now resuming. Instead, I am looking at numbers that do not match anything I have measured on a ranch this size in this county. Nora said nothing. She let the silence hold what it was worth. Dwight came back 2 more times that summer. He began bringing his own monitoring equipment alongside her data. He stopped treating the visits as professional courtesy and started treating them as something that mattered to him personally, which was a different quality of attention entirely. She noticed the shift and did not remark on it, but she filed it in the part of her thinking she kept for things that might become useful. What she did not tell Dwight, because she had not yet decided how to frame it without sounding either paranoid or desperate, was what she had found in her mailbox the same morning he first visited. A letter from Meade County Agricultural Services, formal stationery, the county seal in the upper left corner. The letter informed her that the county had received a complaint regarding management practices on the Callaway property. The complaint cited potential violations of County Grazing Ordinance Section 14B, which required that all livestock operations within designated agricultural zones maintain minimum pasture standards as defined by the County Extension Office. The complaint had been filed by a party who wished to remain anonymous. The county was obligated to investigate and would be scheduling a site inspection within 60 days. She read the letter twice standing in the morning heat beside the mailbox, with sweat already starting on her forearms. Then she folded it and put it in her back pocket and went back to work. She needed to know who had filed the complaint before she decided what to do with the information. Acting without knowing that was the kind of mistake that used up credibility she could not afford to spend. The answer came within a week, indirectly, the way most information came in a county this size. Harriet Voss mentioned during one of her Tuesday visits that Boyd Stanner had been seen having coffee at the county commissioner's office on 3 separate occasions in the past month. Harriet offered this information with the tone she used for all useful intelligence, plain and factual, leaving the implication to land wherever it would find purchase. She neither speculated about what the meetings meant, nor suggested what Nora should do about them. She simply provided the fact and let it sit on the table beside the coffee cups. The financial pressure arrived in written form 11 days later. Orrin Flagg's letter was shorter and less formal than the county notice, which somehow made it more serious. The bank was formally notifying the Callaway account that the balloon payment clause in the original loan agreement would activate in October unless a minimum principal reduction of $40,000 was made against the outstanding balance before that date. The letter noted in language that was precise without being accusatory that the bank had received expressions of interest from third parties regarding the property in the event of default proceedings. The expressions of interest had a specific source, and both Nora and the letter understood that without either of them needing to say it plainly. She sat at the kitchen table with both letters in front of her when Winifred came downstairs. Winifred read them both without speaking. She set them down with the careful deliberateness of a woman suppressing her first reaction in order to make room for her second. "Boyd Stanner is behind both of these," Winifred said. "I believe so." Winifred was quiet for a moment. "He was very pleasant when he came here." "Yes. He never suggested anything like this was possible." "No, that was the point." Winifred looked at the letters again. Then she looked at her daughter with the expression Nora associated with her mother's most consequential decisions. Not warmth, not coldness, but the stripped and functional clarity of someone who has decided to stop being surprised and start being useful. "What do we do?" Nora had spent the previous 2 nights working through this question from every direction she could reach. The $40,000 payment was beyond any amount the ranch could generate through normal operations by October. The county inspection could be managed with data if she had the right person presenting it. The 2 problems required 2 different solutions, and neither solution was guaranteed. "The ranch needs to generate income that doesn't depend on cattle prices or livestock markets," she said. "Something that starts now and builds by itself." She paused. "Tours, educational visits. People will come to see the bison and the native grass restoration if we give them a reason and a clear way to get here. We charge a modest fee. It doesn't solve October, but it creates a documented record of economic activity, and it makes the ranch visible. Visible means harder to swallow quietly." Winifred considered this. "Harriet would help organize. I was going to ask her. I'll talk to her before you do. She responds better when the idea comes from me first." The smallest possible humor in her voice, and the sound of it was enough to ease something in Nora that had been coiled tight since the morning she drove down the county road and saw the sign. The tours began the following Saturday. The first group was small, 9 people, a mix of neighbors who were mostly curious, and one family from Rapid City who had read something in a magazine about prairie restoration and driven 3 hours to see what it looked like in practice. Nora walked them through the eastern pasture, explained the native grass recovery in terms that did not require a degree to follow, showed them the soil monitoring posts with their weekly measurements, let them stand close enough to the bison to understand the scale of the animals, the way they occupied space without apology, the way they moved through grass rather than over it. What she had not anticipated was Winifred. Her mother stood beside the pasture fence with a clipboard containing 2 years of rainfall records and pasture productivity measurements, and spoke to the visitors with the assured confidence of someone who had been studying the subject for years. She knew the numbers because she had been watching the land change alongside her daughter all summer without ever being asked to give a presentation about it, and somewhere in those months she had crossed a line from observer to participant, from someone watching what her daughter was doing to someone doing it herself and understanding why. Nora watched her mother explain groundwater absorption rates to a retired couple from Rapid City and felt something that had been tight inside her chest since March, loosened by a degree that was small but real. The touring income was not going to save them by October. Both of them understood this without needing to say it, but it was real money from real people who had driven to see what was happening on this land. And that reality had its own weight, a different kind of evidence than the numbers in the monitoring notebooks. It was evidence that the outside world found this worth coming to see, which was a different argument than soil moisture percentages, and one that a bank board might weigh differently. October arrived with the particular cold that announces itself in western South Dakota before the calendar officially acknowledges it. A cold that settles into the ground and the buildings and the people who live there. Nora drove to the bank on the 7th of the month with a folder that contained Dwight Sable's preliminary data assessment, the touring income records from 18 documented visits, and a written statement Dwight had agreed to sign as a county soil conservation technician, confirming that the Callaway property was showing measurable improvement across 6 environmental indicators. He had not signed it easily. He had made clear that doing so put him in a complicated position as a county employee involved in a property under active county investigation. He had thought about it for 2 days, but he had signed it, which told Nora something important about what he privately thought the data actually showed. It was not $40,000. It was a case. Orrin Flagg received her in his office and listened without interruption while she laid out each document in order, explaining the context for each and the relationship between them. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, the particular quiet of a man who is doing arithmetic he has not yet decided to share. "You haven't made the payment," he said. "No. This is your documentation in place of the payment." "Yes." He looked at the folder. He looked at Dwight's signed statement. He looked at the touring income summary with its 18 entries over 4 months. He looked at Nora with the expression of a man who finds himself in a situation his procedures did not specifically anticipate and is deciding whether his procedures need to expand to accommodate it. "I will take this to the board," he said finally. "The loan agreement is not flexible because I want it to be. It is flexible only if the board agrees to modify the terms, and the board has reasons for the terms it sets, reasons that exist to protect the other people whose money we hold." He paused. "But I will take it. I will present it fairly." She drove home without knowing whether fairly would be enough. The county inspection came during the 3rd week of October. 2 representatives from Agricultural Services arrived on a Tuesday morning with clipboards and the professional neutrality of people who had been given a determination to make and preferred to make it on evidence rather than opinion. Dwight Sable was already at the eastern pasture fence when their truck pulled in, standing with his own data and the low-key authority of a man who was not there as an advocate, but as a scientist who happened to have 2 years of measurements bearing directly on the question at hand. He introduced himself and offered his data for review before the inspection team had fully unloaded their equipment. His voice was the informational voice of a man who was not asking a political question, but simply making his findings available. The inspection team received his data with the professional courtesy of people who appreciated having more information rather than less. The inspection took 4 hours. The officials were thorough. They measured pasture density and assessed erosion indicators and examined fence conditions and reviewed the herd management records Nora had kept since April. They spoke to Dwight. They spoke to Nora. They spoke briefly to Winifred, who had come out of the house when the truck arrived and stood near the porch with the composed patience of a woman who had decided that what would happen, and that her job was to be present and calm while it did. They noted everything with the disciplined care of people who understood that their findings would be reviewed. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from the county. The inspection had found no violations of Ordinance Section 14B. The management practices on the Callaway property were noted as consistent with sustainable land use standards as currently defined by the County Extension Office. The complaint had been reviewed and found to be without sufficient merit to warrant further action. Nora read the letter standing in the kitchen, still in her coat, the cold of the October morning still in the fabric of it. Then the bank letter arrived 6 days later. The board had agreed to a modified payment schedule, extending the balloon clause by 8 months, contingent on quarterly documentation of economic activity and continuation of the soil conservation improvements that Dwight Sable's assessment had documented. The letter was written in the careful language of an institution that was not doing something because it wanted to, but because the presented evidence had moved it to a position where it could. 8 months, not forgiveness, not rescue. 8 months of the clock stopped, of the ground holding still long enough for the land to have more time to show what it was becoming. She sat at the kitchen table and let the weight of the past 6 months settle around her for the first time. The particular settling that happens when tension held at a constant level is finally allowed to become something less acute. Outside the window, the prairie had gone to its winter colors, brown and gold, and the pale gray of dried grass in cold light. The bison had moved to the western section, where the ridge offered some shelter from the first serious winds of the season. Winifred came in from outside, stomping cold from her boots, and looked at the letter on the table. She looked at Nora's face. 8 months, Nora said. Winifred sat down and read the letter and was quiet for a moment. He knew about the bison, Nora said. Dad, Chester told me the night he delivered the herd. Dad wrote to him 5 years before he died, asking about the same things. He never followed through. She looked at the letter. I think he was waiting until he felt certain enough, and he ran out of time before the certainty came. Winifred was quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against the kitchen windows, with the familiar insistence that had pressed against those windows every winter for as long as the house had stood there. You didn't wait, she said. I didn't have the option. Winifred set the letter down. She looked at it for a long time. 8 months, she said. The second time it sounded less like a sentence about what had been given to them, and more like a decision about what they were going to do with it. That evening after dark, Nora walked the fence line alone. She found it at the northwest corner post. 3 clean cuts in the wire, each one precise, not torn or rusted through, but made deliberately with a tool by someone who had taken the time to do it carefully. The grass at the base of the post was disturbed in the pattern of someone who had approached from outside the property line, from the direction of the county road, and had stood there long enough to work without rushing. She stood in the dark and looked at the cuts. The wind moved through the grass. The nearest bison were somewhere behind her in the field, invisible in the dark, but present, the heavy, patient sound of large animals that had stood on ground like this for 10,000 years before anyone put wire across it to say where it ended and where it began. She pulled out her phone and called Dwight Sable. I need you to come out tomorrow morning, she said, before anyone else gets here. What happened? She looked at the cut wire in the beam of her flashlight. 3 clean cuts that could not have been made by wind or rust or age that had only one explanation. Someone, she said, just made a serious mistake. Dwight arrived at 6:15 the following morning, before the light had fully built above the eastern ridge. He brought a camera and a small evidence kit, the kind that county technicians kept in their trucks for environmental documentation, and he moved along the fence line with the methodical attention of someone who had spent his career reading the language of disturbed ground and soil and the marks that human activity left on the surface of things. He photographed the cut wire from 4 angles. He photographed the approach path through the grass where someone had walked from the county road paralleling the fence for approximately 40 yards before reaching the corner post. He photographed a tire impression in the soft soil near the post. 1 tire-heavy vehicle turned and departed without fully pulling off the road. He photographed a single boot print in the same soft soil, size 11 or 12 deep heel, suggesting a work boot with significant wear on the outer edge. The wear pattern of a person who walked heavily on the outside of their foot. He stood up and looked at the photographs on his camera screen for a long time without speaking. This was deliberate, he said. Yes, whoever made these cuts knew where the bison had been grazing near this section of fence. The animals had been in the northwest quadrant for 4 consecutive days, visible from the county road to anyone who had driven past in daylight. Yes, Nora said. You need the sheriff. She had already called before he arrived. Deputy Calhoun came out that afternoon, took the same photographs with his own camera, listened to Nora's account with the careful attention of someone building a record before drawing conclusions, and said he would look into it. He came back 3 days later with a name. The tire impression matched a vehicle registered to a man named Gary Dietz. Gary Dietz worked for AgriCorps Land Services as a regional field coordinator. He had no prior record of any kind. He had no known personal connection to the Callaway family. When the deputy reached him, Dietz acknowledged driving on the county road near the Callaway property on the evening in question, but denied stopping or leaving the vehicle and offered no explanation for the tire impression in the soil beside the property line. The deputy relayed this to Nora in the same informational tone he had used throughout. The evidence was circumstantial. No action could be taken against Dietz without something more definitive. But the deputy had also traveled to Rapid City and visited Boyd Stanner's office to inform him that the investigation was active and ongoing. How did Stanner respond? Nora asked. Very cooperative, the deputy said. Very concerned about any suggestion of improper conduct. Very precise in his language. He paused. The way a person is precise when they've had time to think about exactly what they're going to say before anyone says anything to them. Boyd Stanner did not contact the Callaway Ranch after the deputy's visit. He did not send another letter or schedule another meeting or send anyone else to drive slowly down the county road. He went quiet in the way that pressure goes quiet when the ground has shifted beneath it, not dramatically, but completely, the way a season ends, rather than the way a storm ends. Harriet Voss reported several weeks later that his coffee visits to the county commissioner's office had stopped entirely. She had heard from a source she declined to name that he had redirected his attention to properties in a different county. Nora stood in the kitchen one evening with this information and let it settle around her. She had expected, she realized, a confrontation. A moment of direct resolution where something happened that she could point to afterward as the decisive event in the story. What she got instead was an absence, a vacancy where the pressure had been. It was not satisfying in the way she had imagined it would be. There was no scene, no exchange of words, no clear moment she could fix in her memory as the turning point. But it was real, and it was complete, and she had learned enough in the past 9 months to understand that real and complete was worth considerably more than dramatic. The winter settled over Meade County with the grinding patience that western South Dakota winters brought. Cold that did not arrive suddenly, but intensified week by week until cold was the only available temperature. Snow that came in layers rather than in events, one fall covering the previous one, the prairie becoming a landscape of muted whites and grays, with the line of the fence posts marking the geometry of the human presence on it. Nora spent those months doing the work that cold months were made for. She reviewed every monitoring post on the property, collected winter soil samples from the same locations she had sampled every month since April, corresponded with 2 university researchers who had requested her data after a regional agricultural journal had published a brief item about the ranch following Adeline Marsh's article. She helped her mother manage the touring schedule, which continued through the winter at a reduced pace. Families and students, and occasionally a researcher making the drive out to Faith to see what the numbers were connected to. Winifred had taken over the financial tracking entirely, maintaining the quarterly documentation that Orrin Flagg's modified agreement required. She had also taken over leading the tours when Nora was occupied elsewhere, developing her own version of the presentation that was subtly different from Nora's, more historical, more personal, grounded in the particular memory of a woman who had watched this land for 30 years and could tell you exactly which pasture had held water best in a drought year and which fence line had needed the most maintenance and why. The bison moved through the snow with a self-possession that Nora never stopped finding remarkable. They did not cluster near shelters or push toward stored food. They moved through the winter prairie as though it were simply the familiar season, that it was using their massive heads to sweep snow from the grass beneath, standing in temperatures that would have required supplemental heat for cattle, entirely indifferent to the cold in the way of animals that had been shaped by exactly this cold for far longer than any human management system had existed to interfere with them. She watched them from the ridge one February morning when the temperature had dropped well below zero and the light came across the snow at an angle that turned the whole prairie into something between silver and pale gold. The kind of light that only existed at certain latitudes and certain seasons, and that she had grown up with, and that still every winter managed to look new. 12 animals had become 19. She counted them from the ridge, her breath showing white, Hatch sitting at her feet with his chin on his front paws. She looked down at the old dog. His muzzle was almost entirely white now. He had begun sleeping more heavily, rising from his mat beside the stove, with a careful deliberateness that had not been there a year ago. The careful deliberateness of an old animal doing the quiet arithmetic of what it still had and what it was spending, and trying to balance the two as long as it could. She put her gloved hand on his head. He pressed into it with the absolute and uncomplicated affection he had always offered her, the kind that does not assess whether it is warranted and does not calculate whether it is returned. Spring came eventually, the way it always came to that part of South Dakota, not gently but as a contest between the two temperatures, cold and warmth, pushing against each other for weeks, until warmth finally insisted with enough force to make it stick. The land emerged from the snow with the dark richness of soil that had been held under insulating pressure all winter and was now releasing. And the releasing smelled like the particular smell of damp earth in the Great Plains. That is also, she had always felt the smell of the land deciding to continue. The difference from 2 years ago was visible before May had finished establishing itself. The Callaway Ranch was not uniformly transformed. There were still patches of compacted ground near the old cattle holding areas, still corners where the native grasses had not yet found their full footing, still sections of fence where the wood showed 30 years of weather and use. But in the eastern and northern pastures, the change was impossible to mistake for anything but what it was. Big blue stem that had been thin and scattered 2 years ago now grew in dense stands that swayed in the wind with the motion of something that had been there a long time and intended to remain. Indian grass had appeared in sections where Nora had not planted it, carried by wind and by the movement of the bison between grazing areas, the animals functioning as seed distributors the way they had always functioned before anyone put wire across the prairie to prevent them from moving freely. The ground was darker when she pushed her probe in. 2 years ago, the topsoil had been pale and thin and gave up almost no resistance to the probe because there was so little organic matter to hold it together. Now the soil had a depth of darkness that told a specific story about the microbial life that had returned to it, about the organic matter building in the root zones of the native grasses, about the soil becoming itself again, rather than simply existing as a thin medium between the roots and the air. She drove to the county office in April and laid her full 2-year data summary on Dwight Sable's desk. He read it for 20 minutes without speaking. When he looked up, his expression had the quality she had learned to associate with someone who has confirmed something they suspected but had not yet been willing to fully commit to. "I need to make a phone call," he said. Dr. Cornelia Brandt arrived in May with a team of 4 specialists from the South Dakota Department of Agriculture. She was 46 tall and athletic, with short, silver-streaked brown hair and hazel eyes that moved across a landscape with the systematic efficiency of a scientist who had been wrong enough times to stop trusting first impressions. She had spent the previous decade studying degraded rangeland across the Great Plains and had developed the particular fluency of someone who could tell genuine ecological recovery from the kind of surface change that looked good in photographs and measured poorly under rigorous examination. She did not arrive warmly. She arrived the way scientists arrive at data, with focused attention and suspended judgment and the quality of someone who has no stake in the outcome except that it be accurate. Her team spread across the property with their equipment. The first day they established baselines, confirming and extending the monitoring that Dwight and Nora had built over 2 years, taking independent measurements from the same locations and additional ones to ensure the sampling was representative. The second day they were in the field pulling soil cores, documenting vegetation density across multiple transects, measuring the old drainage channels along the eastern section, where erosion had been running unchecked before the native grasses started holding the ground together. On the evening of the second day, Cornelia came to the kitchen table with a soil core from the northeast corner. She set it on the table. The dark, healthy earth extended deeper into the core than the pale, compacted material from the same location 2 years ago, by a margin that was visible without needing to measure it, that told its story immediately to anyone who knew what soil was supposed to look like. Cornelia looked at it for a long time without speaking. "This should not have happened this quickly," she said. Nora smiled. "Someone else told me that." Cornelia looked at her. "Dwight Sable. I reviewed his documentation before I came out here." A brief pause. "His methodology is sound. He is meticulous." "He is." Another pause shorter. "You gave him something worth being meticulous about." The third day of the assessment brought something Nora had not planned for. Cornelia received a phone call mid-morning and stepped away from her team to take it privately. When she came back, her expression had changed by a small but readable amount, the change of someone who has just been told something that requires them to decide how they are going to respond to it before they speak. She found Nora near the south fence and said, directly and without any preliminary, "I received a call this morning from a representative of AgriCorps Land Services who identified himself as Boyd Stanner. He said he wanted to provide some context about this property and what he described as claims being made about its management history." Nora said nothing. "He implied that the data being presented to my office might reflect selective sampling rather than conditions representative of the full property." Cornelia paused. "He was very measured in his language. Careful." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that independent scientific assessment does not operate on the basis of information supplied by parties with a financial interest in the outcome." A slight pause. "Then I spent the rest of the afternoon taking soil cores from the sections of the property he implied were being underrepresented in our sampling." And Cornelia looked across the pasture toward the northern section where the big bluestem was already taller than it had been this time last year. "The data from those sections is stronger than the data from the sections you originally highlighted in your own summary." Something pressed upward from Nora's chest. Something that was almost laughter and almost relief, and entirely gratitude for the fundamental stubbornness of evidence, for the fact that what was true remained true, regardless of who preferred that it not be. "He helped," she said. "Unintentionally," Cornelia agreed. "But measurably, yes." The final report was completed in August of 1997 and distributed to the South Dakota Department of Agriculture, the County Extension Office, the State University's Land Management Research Center, and 3 national conservation organizations that had requested copies based on the preliminary findings. It documented in the careful and precise language of institutional science what Nora had spent 3 years building in the dirt with a notebook and a soil probe, and the particular kind of faith that does not require certainty before it begins to act. Topsoil stability restored across approximately 60% of the total acreage. Water absorption rates 42% above the county average for comparable properties. Native prairie species density at levels not recorded in Meade County since pre-commercial ranching surveys from the early 20th century. Drought resilience significantly above regional baseline across all sampled locations. The bison herd, now 23 animals, including 3 calves born that spring, maintaining health and productivity indicators consistent with a sustainable, long-term operation that did not depend on supplemental inputs. The report made no editorial comments, but the numbers had their own eloquence, the kind that does not require embellishment because the facts themselves are the argument. Within 3 months, land appraisers had begun reassessing prairie properties across the region, citing the Callaway data as evidence of what native grassland restoration could support in long-term agricultural value. The Callaway Ranch received an independent appraisal in October of 1997. The value exceeded by a margin that neither Nora nor Winifred had been prepared for the number that Boyd Stanner had offered 3.5 years ago, as rescue, as relief, as the only reasonable option left to them. Winifred stood in the kitchen with the appraisal in her hands and read the number twice. Then she sat down. "I almost took less than half of this," she said. Nora sat across from her. "Yes, because I was frightened. You were doing the best math available to you at the time. When you had different numbers, you made a different calculation. That's not a failure. That's what people do." Winifred looked at her. "The mineral rights clause. Yes. You saw it immediately. I was reading for it. You weren't looking for it because he hadn't given you any reason to look. That's not a failure of attention. That's how those clauses work. That's why they're written the way they're written." Winifred looked at the appraisal again, and then set it on the table in the same place where the Agricor contract had sat 3.5 years ago. In the same kitchen, in the same light, on the same table where most of the significant decisions of their lives had been made. Orrin Flagg came to the ranch the following week. He sat at the table and drank coffee and arrived at the point without wasting time on ceremony. "I want to offer you a preferential lending arrangement," he said. "Expanded credit at favorable rates for herd expansion and infrastructure improvements. Whatever the operation needs to scale." He paused. "There are 14 ranchers in this county who have contacted my office in the past 3 months asking about financing for native grass transitions. Your property is the reason they are asking. That is not a small thing. That is a category of agricultural lending that did not exist here 12 months ago." Nora looked at him across the table. "I appreciate that," she said, but I am not going to borrow against this land again." Flagg waited. "My father borrowed against it because he had no other option. We borrowed against it because we had no other option. The moment we have other options, we stop borrowing against the land." She looked at the table for a moment. "What I would like instead is this. I would like the bank to look at a community structure for small ranchers who want to make the transition but cannot absorb the initial costs themselves. Not loans to us. Loans coordinated through a framework we help establish, with our data and our methodology as the demonstrated basis for what the investment is worth." Flagg looked at her for a long moment. "That is a considerably more complicated proposal," he said. "I know." He was quiet, doing some internal accounting that showed in the slight movement of his jaw. Then he nodded, once the nod of a man who has decided to apply his expertise to a problem rather than to argue against its existence. "Let me look at the structure." He picked up his coffee. "Your father would have had opinions about the interest rates on something like this. He would have argued with you until one of you ran out of coffee." Flagg almost smiled. "It was a brief thing, but it was genuine. He usually outlasted me." Vic Prudhoe came to the ranch on a Saturday afternoon in November. He drove up the lane with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision that required effort and is not going to turn back from it after coming this far. He stepped out of his truck and looked at the pastures for a long time before he walked toward where Nora was working the north fence, and she could see from the way he walked that he was not there to argue about anything. She put down the pliers and waited. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me anything, Vic." "I do." He was not comfortable with what he was about to do, and he did not try to conceal that discomfort, which made what followed more honest than a practiced apology would have been. "I spent 2 years telling anyone who would listen that you were destroying this place. I said it at the feed store and at the auction and once to your mother's face when I had no business saying it to her face." Nora had not known about the last one, and I was wrong. He said it the way he said difficult things, directly and without decoration, without any language designed to reduce the weight of it. Not about everything. I still think there were faster ways and better managed ways to do what you did. But I was wrong about whether it was possible. And I was wrong to say what I said as confidently as I said it to as many people as I said it to. He looked toward the eastern pasture where the tall grass was moving in the late November light, the same grass he had watched growing all summer from the road. The grass that had seemed so wrong to him, and that had turned out to be exactly right. "My south section is coming back. Slowly, but it is coming. I used your soil protocol. Dwight Sable walked me through it. I know, Dwight told me. I should have told you myself. He looked back at her. So I am telling you. Nora looked at him. She thought about the livestock auction in April of 1994, the laughter, the weight of it from the inside. She thought about what it cost a man like Vic Prudo to stand in front of someone he had wronged and say it plainly, without reaching for a qualifying clause or a softening phrase that would make it easier on himself. Thank you, she said. He nodded. He looked out at the prairie again, where the late light was moving across the tall grass in long, slow waves, the way light always moved across it in November, amber and horizontal and unhurried. Your father, he said, was one of the best cattlemen in this county. A pause. You might be better at this than he was at his thing. He got back in his truck before she could answer, which she suspected was intentional. She stood in the cold and watched him drive down the lane. Then she climbed the hill. She went there at the end of difficult seasons, the long, low ridge along the western edge of the property that gave a view of the full sweep of the ranch from the south fence to the northern horizon. Her father had brought her there when she was 6 to watch a thunderstorm cross the prairie from the north, standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder, not explaining anything, just letting her see it as if the seeing itself were the lesson. Winifred was already there. Her mother stood with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking out across the pastures, the way she looked at every difficult thing in her life, directly and without flinching, with the composure of a woman who had decided early that looking away from hard things did not make them any smaller. Nora stood beside her. The bison were moving through the big blue stem in the northern section, 23 animals in the long, golden light of late November. The calves born in spring were nearly full size now. The older cows moved with the authority of animals that had fully accepted this land as theirs as home, rather than territory as the place they had been made for and had finally been returned to. The grass was alive around them. Not alive in the way a managed field is alive, controlled and deliberate, independent. Alive in the way the prairie had been alive before anyone built fences across it, with the wildness that was not chaos, but the deep, practiced order of 10,000 years of self-correction, of land knowing what it needed and doing it when the things that had been preventing it were finally moved aside. For a long time, neither woman spoke. Then Winifred said, "Your father spent his entire life protecting this land." Nora looked at the horizon. The light was changing toward the colors of late afternoon amber and rose, coming into the grass, the sky going a deeper blue above the ridgeline. I know. I nearly became the person who gave it away. Winifred's voice did not break. She was not the kind of woman whose voice broke, but something in it changed texture, shifted from the controlled register she used for most things to something closer to what she actually felt. I thought I was being practical. I thought I was doing the responsible thing with what was left of us. You were. Winifred looked at her. You were protecting us with everything you had and everything you knew at the time, Nora said. When you had more information, you made a different choice. And you made it yourself on your own terms. When Adeline's article came out and the picture of what Boyd Stanner had done in other places became clear, you were the one who called him and told him the property was no longer available. Not me. I was ready to argue it for another 3 months. You picked up the phone. Winifred looked back at the prairie. I almost didn't, she said quietly. Almost doesn't count out here. Winifred made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then she was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had the texture of something she had been carrying for a long time that she was finally allowing herself to put down. He would have loved this, she said. Harlan. Nora thought of Chester Ironwood's letter, which had arrived 2 weeks after the appraisal came in. Chester did not write long letters. This one was a single paragraph in his direct and careful hand. He had heard about the report. He had heard about the numbers. He had written Harlan saw what the land needed. He chose the right person to carry it forward. The land remembers everything. It does not forget what it was. It only waits. Winifred had read the letter at the kitchen table and sat with it for a long time afterward without moving. That evening, for the first time since Harlan Calloway's funeral 3 years ago, Nora had heard her mother cry. Not the quiet, managed kind that Winifred kept private, but the other kind. The kind that comes when grief, and something that is not quite its opposite, arrives simultaneously and cannot be untangled from each other because they were never separate to begin with. Nora had not gone upstairs. She had stayed at the kitchen table and let her mother have the fullness of it, the unobserved completeness of a feeling that had been held carefully in check for 3 years, and finally had somewhere to go. Now on the ridge in the November light, Winifred reached over and took her daughter's hand for a moment, and then let go. Nora noticed the absence beside her feet, the space where Hatch had always been when she climbed this hill, the warm weight of him against her leg, the quiet company of a dog who had belonged to her father. And then, without ceremony or negotiation or any formal transfer of loyalty, had belonged to her. She had buried him in October near the old cottonwood at the east corner of the yard, before sunrise, alone, and had not cried until she was back inside the house with the door closed. She did not mention this to her mother. Some losses did not need to be spoken to be shared. The light was going now, settling below the horizon, in the long, unhurried way of prairie sunsets. As though the day understood it was leaving something worth not rushing away from. Something worth the respect of a slow departure. Nora Calloway stood on the ridge above her father's land and looked at what it had become. Not what she had made it. What it had always been beneath the compacted topsoil and the drought damage, and the 30 years of management that had fought the prairie instead of listening to it, that had treated the land as a problem to be solved rather than a system to be understood. She had come home in the spring of 1994 with a bag of research papers and a conviction she could not yet prove to anyone who needed proof before they would listen. She had stood in a kitchen with a legal document on the table and told her mother to wait one more time when waiting had already cost them more than they could afford. She had sold cattle she had watched being born on this land, animals that had bloodlines her father had spent years building. She had used the last of his savings to fund an idea that everyone around her believed was a form of grief-distorted wishful thinking dressed up in scientific language. She had been mocked at a livestock auction in front of people who had eaten at her parents' table. She had received a county complaint designed to end her before the land had time to show anyone anything. She had sat in a bank with a folder of data instead of $40,000 and asked a man whose entire professional life was organized around money to look at something that was not money and see the same value she saw in it. She had found cut wire in the dark and understood that someone had decided the best strategy was to make the animals themselves into the instrument of her failure. And the land had done the rest. Not because of the science, though the science had given names to what was happening and a framework for understanding it, and a language for persuading the people who needed persuading. Not because of the stubbornness, though the stubbornness had kept her working on mornings when the data was still thin and the outcome was still genuinely uncertain, and the easier thing would have been to stop. The land had healed because healing was what it was designed to do, given enough time and enough removal of the specific things that had been preventing it. She had simply been willing to believe that before she could see it. That was the only part that had been entirely hers. The first star appeared in the darkening sky above the eastern ridge, and then a second, and then the sky began to fill the way prairie skies fill at dusk, quickly and completely, as though darkness were not the absence of light, but a presence of its own that had been waiting patiently at the edges all day for permission to come in. Winifred stood beside her daughter and looked out at the prairie in the last of the light. The bison were shapes in the tall grass, moving in their slow, purposeful way, unhurried, entirely at home. The wind moved across the grass in long, slow waves, the same wind that had moved across this land every season for longer than any fence or road or roof had existed to interrupt it. It carried the smell of cold earth and dried grass, and the faint mineral sharpness of the first real snow coming down from the north. Not tonight, but soon a day or two at most, close enough that the prairie could already smell it. They stood together on the ridge and let the land be what it was, two women above a piece of earth that had outlasted every prediction made about it, listening to the wind move through the tall grass with the voice the prairie had always used, old and patient, and against all reasonable expectation, still very much alive. The weeks that followed Chester Ironwood's departure settled into the rhythm that all first seasons settle into when you are trying something that has never been done in a particular place before. The rhythm of watching and measuring and adjusting and watching again, of learning to read a language you have studied in books but never yet heard spoken aloud. Nora woke before sunrise every morning and walked the eastern pasture with Hatch before the rest of the county had started its day. She learned the individual personalities of the bison faster than she had expected to. The dominant cow, a large female she noted in her records as E1, had established a clear hierarchy within the first 2 weeks and maintained it with the calm efficiency of an animal that understood that order was more useful than dominance for its own sake. The bull, the one Chester had called a solid animal, moved through the herd with the authority of something that had never had a reason to question its own right to be where it was. She filled 3 notebooks between April and September of that first year. The notebooks were the kind that ranchers and scientists and people who needed to keep track of things used hardcover waterproof on the outside with graph paper pages that could hold measurements alongside prose. She recorded soil moisture readings at 12 fixed points on the property, every week, sometimes twice a week after rainfall. She recorded the height and density of the native grasses at the same 12 points. She recorded the position of the herd at the end of each day, mapping their movement through the pasture sections. She recorded the weather, the temperature and the wind direction, and the rainfall total from the gauge mounted on the barn. The data in the first 3 months was modest. 15% moisture improvement at the northeast corner. Slight increases in big blue stem density along the eastern fence line. Nothing that would have moved a bank board or silenced Vic Prudo. But the data was real, and it was building, and every week there was slightly more of it than the week before, which was its own kind of argument, even before the argument could be made. Harriet Voss came over most Tuesday evenings and sat at the kitchen table while Nora transferred the week's field notes into the organized, summary notebooks she kept for reference. Harriet rarely commented on the data itself, having no training for it, but she listened with the attention of someone who understood that what she was hearing mattered to the people it mattered to, and that being present for it was its own form of contribution. Sometimes she brought food. Sometimes she brought news from other parts of the county, the kind of news that traveled by phone and coffee and church parking lots, and that was useful to know even when it was not directly relevant. It was Harriet who first mentioned that people were beginning to talk differently about the Callaway place. Not less and not yet approvingly, but differently. The mocking had been consistent in its first form, the form of people who had already decided and were simply sharing their decision with each other for the pleasure of agreement. This new form was less certain. It had the quality of people who were watching rather than deciding, who had noticed something they had not expected and were not yet sure what to do with it. "Delbert Burrow told me your grass is the tallest on the county road," Harriet said one Tuesday evening in early August. "He said it like it was a problem, but I think he was just saying it because he didn't know what else to say about it." Nora looked up from her notebook. "How tall is Delbert's grass?" "About this high." Harriet held her hand a few inches off the table. Nora said nothing and went back to her notebook, but she filed the information where she kept things that would eventually be useful. The first summer ended and the second began. The drought that had been building in the background of western South Dakota for several years intensified in the summer of 1995, and then more in the summer of 1996. And the difference between the Callaway property and the neighboring ranches became harder and harder to explain as something other than what it was. Adeline Marsh came out on a Thursday in late August of 1996, driving a car that had clearly seen better roads than the one she had put it on that morning. She was 31 with short auburn hair and sharp blue eyes, and the particular quality of someone who had trained herself to be curious about things other people had already made up their minds about. She had written several pieces about rural communities that larger publications had passed on, and smaller ones had run to modest response. And she had the instinct for a story that was about something larger than it appeared on the surface. She stepped out of her car and looked at the Mitchell property from the county road for a moment before she walked up to where Nora was working the east fence. The contrast with the neighboring pastures was visible from where she had parked. The Callaway grass, tall and still green in late August, the surrounding properties showing the brown and yellow of drought stress. "You're the one everyone in Faith said was going to go broke," Adeline said. Nora looked at her. "That's me. Your grass is greener than everyone else's." "It is." Adeline looked at the grass for a moment. "I'd like to write about that." Nora told her about the 2 years of data and offered to let her read the monitoring notebooks. Adeline spent the rest of that day on the property, walking the pastures, interviewing Nora, interviewing Winifred, and photographing the bison in the late afternoon light, with the patient professionalism of someone who understood that the image that told the story best was rarely the first one you took. She asked questions that showed she had done background reading, and she asked follow-up questions that showed she had listened to the answers. The piece she wrote ran 6 weeks later in a regional paper based in Rapid City and was picked up by 2 other regional publications within the same week. The headline was modest and accurate: "Young Rancher Defies Drought with Prairie Restoration." The story was better than the headline. Adeline had understood that the real story was not the grass, or the bison, or even the drought, but the argument embedded in the contrast between what the Callaway property was doing and what the surrounding ranches were going through. The argument about what land could be if you stopped fighting it. People started coming out to see for themselves. Not dozens, not at first. A few at a time, curious ranchers, and a county commissioner, and a soil conservation volunteer from a neighboring county, and a family from Rapid City that had driven out because someone had left Adeline's article on the break room table at their workplace. Then more came. Vehicles parked along the county road on Saturday mornings. Winifred started keeping a visitor log, noting names and where people had come from and what questions they had asked, partly for the touring income records, and partly because she had begun to understand that what was happening here had a reach she had not originally imagined. One Saturday in early September, Nora was explaining root depth measurements to a group of 8 ranchers when she noticed Vic Prudhoe standing at the edge of the group. He had not introduced himself or announced his presence. He stood with his arms folded across his chest, in the posture of a man attending a presentation he has reservations about, and listening with the particular attention of someone looking for the flaw in the argument. After the others left, he stayed. He stood at the pasture fence and looked at the grass without speaking for a long time. Nora waited. "My south pasture is finished," he said finally. "Stop producing usable forage in July. I've bought more supplemental hay this year than I've bought in the last 3 years combined." She said nothing. "My grandfather ran this county when the grass was shoulder high," he said. "He told me once the land would come back to that if people let it. I thought he was talking about the old days." He paused. He wasn't talking about the old days. Nora looked at him. "What do I need to start?" he asked. She thought about the auction yard in April of 1994. She thought about every joke, every rumor, every version of the same laughter. She thought about what her father had said when she was a teenager about people who made mistakes publicly, which was that the measure of a person was not whether they were wrong, but whether they could say so. "Start by looking below the grass," she said. "Get a probe and measure your soil moisture at the same 10 locations every week for a month before you change anything. You need a baseline before you can measure improvement." He nodded. He looked at the pasture one more time. "I'll come back," he said, and drove down the lane. The winter between 1996 and 1997 passed with the productive quiet that hard winters imposed on the prairie. Nora corresponded with Professor Wentworth at the university, who had requested copies of her data for a research paper he was writing on native grass restoration in the Great Plains. She corresponded with two other researchers who had contacted her through the university after Adeline's article had been cited in an agricultural journal. She spent evenings reading the research papers they sent her, annotating them in the same cramped margins she had used in college, finding in the peer-reviewed literature the confirmation of things she had been observing in her own pastures, and the context for things she had observed but not yet understood. Winifred began the winter by managing the touring schedule and ended it by effectively co-directing the educational component of the ranch's program. She had developed an expertise in the financial comparison between the Callaway approach and conventional operations that Nora found genuinely illuminating, the expertise of someone who thought in numbers and had spent 25 years watching the money side of a cattle ranch, and now had the comparative data to say precisely what the difference looked like in dollars per acre over time. She also developed slowly, and without announcing it, a new relationship with the land itself. Nora would find her mother standing in the eastern pasture at odd times, just looking the way Harlan had stood in pastures and looked. Not measuring, not recording, just watching the land do what it was doing. When Nora mentioned this to her once, quietly Winifred looked at her for a moment. "Your father used to say that the land told you things if you were quiet enough to hear it," she said. "I always thought that was poetic. I'm starting to think he meant it literally." The spring of 1997 arrived with a warmth that felt earned after the long winter, and the land rose to meet it with the vigor of something that had been gathering itself under the snow. The eastern pasture was a different thing from what it had been 3 years ago. Not finished, not complete, but genuinely different, genuinely alive in a way that had no precedent in the 30 years Winifred had been watching it. Dwight Sable came out in the second week of April and stood in the middle of the eastern pasture for a long time without taking any measurements. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. Nora waited. "I put in a request to the state office 6 months ago to have your property included in a formal, long-term study on native prairie restoration outcomes." He paused. "The request was approved. Dr. Cornelia Brandt is leading the team." Another pause. "She's skeptical. She's been told about too many operations that look like this and measured differently when examined rigorously. She will come with her own equipment and her own methodology, and she will not be impressed by what she saw in Adeline Marsh's article." "Good," Nora said. Dwight looked at her. "If she comes out here and measures the same things I've been measuring and gets the same results," Nora said, "then the results mean something to people who couldn't trust them before. That's worth more than being impressive." Dwight thought about this. "You're not wrong," he said. When Dr. Brandt arrived in May, she arrived with 4 specialists in 2 weeks of planned fieldwork, and the professional skepticism she carried everywhere. The skepticism of a scientist who had been disappointed by promising results before and had learned to require multiple lines of independent evidence before she was willing to call something real. She was also, Nora learned during the first evening's conversation over coffee at the kitchen table, not entirely without personal investment in the question. She had grown up on a ranch in Nebraska that her family had sold when she was 12, after a drought that the shallow-rooted grass could not survive. She had become a rangeland ecologist partly because of that experience. She had spent 20 years studying the damage that had been done to land like her family's, and she had found very little evidence that the damage could be meaningfully reversed within a human time frame. "What made you think it was possible here?" she asked Nora. "I had a professor who told me the land remembered what it was before we changed it." Nora paused. "At the time, I thought he was being poetic." Cornelia looked at her. "Was he?" "Come back in 2 weeks," Nora said, "and tell me what you think." The assessment proceeded with the thoroughness of a scientist who understood that one shot at a data set was all she was likely to get, and intended to make the most of it. Cornelia's team sampled more locations than Nora and Dwight had sampled, used additional measurement techniques, and spent more time on the property than the planned 2 weeks required. They stayed a third week, then a fourth. On the last morning, Cornelia came to the kitchen table early, before Winifred was up, and sat with a cup of coffee she had poured herself. She looked at the map of the property spread on the table, the same map Nora had brought home from college 3 years ago, now marked and annotated and weathered with use. "I grew up thinking my family's land was gone," she said. "Not sold, but gone. Changed into something it couldn't come back from." She looked at the map for a moment. "I've been wrong about that." Nora said nothing. "Not just here," Cornelia continued. "What you've done here is one instance of something that is apparently more possible than I believed it was. Which means the land I grew up on might not be gone either." She paused. "That's a different kind of finding from the ones I put in reports." "It's the most important one," Nora said. Cornelia almost smiled. "Yes, I suppose it is." The report went out in August, and the response to it went out from there in all directions, like water from a point where rain has hit a flat surface, spreading outward until it found the edges of whatever contained it. Researchers called. Conservation organizations requested permission to cite the data. 2 university departments asked whether the Callaway property could be included in ongoing regional studies. A journalist from a national agricultural publication contacted Adeline Marsh to ask who to talk to about a follow-up piece. Within the county, the response was quieter, but more significant to Nora. 11 ranchers requested copies of the soil monitoring protocol from Dwight Sable's office. 3 of them hired him to help them establish baseline measurements on their own properties. Vic Prudo converted 30% of his south section to the rotational grazing approach, working from Nora's data and his own observations of what that approach had done for the Callaway land. He did this without announcement and without asking Nora to validate the decision, which told her something about where he had arrived in his thinking. The independent appraisal came in October, and the number it contained was large enough that Winifred had to sit down when she read it. Large enough that it changed the shape of everything that came after it, the way a significant number always changes the shape of the conversation that follows it. The next morning, Orrin Flagg called the ranch. He was not calling about the loan, which had been fully serviced by that point, the modified schedule, long since fulfilled, and then some. He was calling because 14 ranchers had contacted his office in the past 3 months, asking about financing for native grass transitions, and he needed to understand what was being proposed well enough to explain it to his board. He came out the following week, and the conversation they had at the kitchen table was a different conversation from the one they had had 3 years earlier in his office. Different in the specific way that conversations are different when both people in them have more information than they had before and know that the other person does too. He left with a commitment to look at the community lending structure Nora had proposed. Not a yes, but a yes that was looking for the right question to answer. 3 weeks later, Adeline Marsh called. "I have something I should tell you before it gets published," she said. "What is it?" "I've been doing a longer piece, bigger scope than the drought article, about AgriCorps land services, and Boyd Stanner specifically." She paused. "It turns out Faith isn't the only county where he showed up when ranchers were struggling. Nebraska, Wyoming, the eastern parts of this state. The pattern is the same. He arrives when the drought is bad and the debt is high, and he makes offers that look like rescue. The mineral rights clauses are in all of them." Another pause. "In Nebraska, 2 families signed before anyone noticed the clause. The exploratory surveys started 18 months after closing. Neither family had any legal recourse." Nora stood at the kitchen counter where she had taken the call and looked out the window at the eastern pasture where the big blue stem was standing tall in the October light. "When does it run?" she asked. "Next week. Regional distribution and 2 national agricultural publications." "Thank you for telling me first." "You were the one who didn't sign," Adeline said. "I thought you should know that mattered." Boyd Stanner did not contact the Callaway Ranch after the article ran. He did not send a letter or make a call or dispatch anyone else to drive slowly down the county road. He was simply gone from the immediate landscape of their lives, the way a season is gone when the next one arrives completely and without remainder. Harriet Voss reported that his name no longer came up in the county commissioner's office. Deputy Calhoun mentioned in a brief phone call that the investigation into Gary Dietz and the cut fence had been closed without charges, but that the documentation would remain on file. It was not the conclusion Nora had imagined. She had imagined something more direct, something that felt more like justice than like absence. But the thing she had worked for, the thing that had mattered from the beginning, was not the conclusion of that particular story. It was the land. The land was the conclusion. The land was what remained when the people who had wanted to use it for something else were gone. She stood on the ridge on a Tuesday in late October and looked at it, and it was still there, still becoming what it had been becoming since 12 bison walked off a trailer and into the grass 3.5 years ago, still following the logic of its own recovery towards something that had been interrupted and was now resuming, with or without anyone's permission, because that was what the land did when you let it. Winifred came up behind her and stood at her shoulder. The bison were in the northern section, 23 shapes, moving slowly through the tall grass in the long light. Chester rode again, Winifred said. What did he say? He said he'd like to bring out another 12 animals in the spring, if we want them. He said the herd size is ready for it, and the land looks ready from the data he's been following. She paused. He also said he's been talking to 4 other ranches in the western part of the state about starting similar programs. He wants to know if you'll consult. Nora looked at the grass moving in the wind. Tell him yes, she said. She looked at the land. She thought about what Professor Wentworth had said, that the land remembered what it was before people changed it. She thought about what Chester had said, that Harlan had seen the same thing and had run out of time before he could trust it. She thought about the notebooks in the barn with 30 years of her father's observations, the record of a man who had watched this land every day and had understood something about it that he had not had the words or the courage or the time to act on. She had acted on it for him. That was one way to understand what the past 3 years had been. Another way was that she had acted on it for herself because she believed it, and because the land was worth fighting for, and because some things were true regardless of whether everyone around you believed them yet. The light was going, settling into the horizon in the long way of prairie sunsets. The wind moved across the grass in the voice it had always used on this land, old and patient, and carrying in it something that was older than the fences or the roads or the names that people had put on the places. Something that had been here before any of that and would be here after all of it. 2 women stood on a ridge above a piece of earth and let it be what it was. The first stars appeared. The bison moved through the grass. The prairie held still and breathed. The summer Nora turned 24 was the summer she learned what it meant to be afraid of something you had already committed to. The fear was not the sharp kind. It was the slow kind, the kind that builds in the background of a person's daily work and does not announce itself as fear because it presents itself as observation. The observation was this. It was mid-July. The ground was still responding as the data said it should. The native grasses were doing what she had predicted they would do. And yet the fear was there, quiet and persistent, because the gap between what the data showed and what the data needed to show by October was still significant. And the months remaining between July and October were not long enough to close it entirely. She did not talk to Winifred about the fear. Her mother had enough to carry. She did not talk to Dwight Sable about it because Dwight dealt in measurements and not in the emotional dimension of what the measurements were supporting. She talked to Harriet Voss about it on a Tuesday evening in late July, sitting on the porch with the heat of the day finally beginning to ease into something tolerable. Harriet listened with the full attention she always gave things that mattered to the people she cared about. Tell me what you're actually afraid of, Harriet said when Nora had finished. That I was wrong about the land. No, I'm not afraid of being wrong about the land. The data says I'm not wrong about the land. She looked at the dark pasture. I'm afraid I was wrong about the timing, that the land is right and the approach is right, but that it takes 4 years instead of 2, and I committed to a timeline that doesn't account for that. Harriet was quiet for a moment. And if that's true, then we lose the ranch for a reason that isn't stupidity and isn't failure, but is just the difference between 2 years and 4 years, which is not a difference you can explain to a bank board. Harriet looked at her. Harlan used to say that the right thing done too late was still the right thing. He said it usually about repairs he'd put off. She paused. I don't think he was only talking about repairs. Nora was quiet for a long time. The night sounds of the prairie settled around them. The insects and the distant bison, and the wind in the grass that never entirely stopped. He would have known what to do, she said. It came out quieter than she had intended. Harriet looked at her steadily. He would have been scared too, she said. Harlan was scared plenty of times. He just didn't show it except to people who were paying close attention. She paused. You're showing it to me, which means you're doing exactly what he did. Nora looked at the dark pasture for a long time after that. The next morning she was in the eastern pasture before sunrise with her probe and her notebook, and the numbers she recorded were the numbers that were there to be recorded. And she wrote them down and carried them back to the house and transferred them to the summary notebook, and then went out to check the south fence because the south fence had been showing some posts that needed attention, and the attention had been put off long enough. That was the summer she understood something that the data could not capture, which was that the work itself was the answer to the fear. Not the results of the work, the work. The getting up before sunrise and going into the pasture and recording the numbers and doing the maintenance and managing the herd and writing the letters and sitting across from Orrin Flagg with a folder of information that was not $40,000, but was everything she had to offer. The doing of it was the answer to the question of whether she could do it, and the answer was yes, because she was doing it every day, and the land was doing its part alongside her. By August, the fear had receded to where it lived in ordinary circumstances as background rather than foreground, as one of the ongoing conditions of a life lived in the direction of something not yet certain, rather than the dominant feature of her days. The autumn passed, and the county inspection came and went, and the bank letter came, and the 8 months began, and Nora entered the second winter with something she had not had at the end of the first one, which was a specific body of evidence that the land was doing what she had said it would do, not at the speed she had hoped for, but in the direction she had predicted, which was the kind of argument that could be made to a board of people whose job was to manage other people's money carefully. Dwight Sable came out twice that winter, once in December and once in February, taking soil temperatures and measuring winter moisture retention at the same 12 locations she had been monitoring since April of the previous year. Each visit produced numbers that were incrementally better than the previous visit's numbers. The small improvements that were invisible to the eye, but legible in the data. The kind of progress that only becomes visible in retrospect when you lay 12 months of measurements beside each other and see the direction they have been traveling all along. On the February visit, he arrived earlier than expected and found Nora already in the eastern pasture, despite the fact that the temperature was well below zero and the wind was making itself felt in the particular way it made itself felt in a South Dakota February, which was as a physical force rather than merely a climatic condition. He walked out to where she was standing. "What are you looking at?" he asked. She pointed to a spot in the snow-covered grass about 20 feet ahead of them. "Dig down there," she said, "just a few inches." He looked at her. Then he crouched and scraped the snow aside with his gloved hand and pushed 2 fingers into the soil beneath it. He felt around for a moment, then he looked up. "It's warmer than it should be," he said. "The root mass, the organic matter in the root zones holds heat. The soil is insulated from below, now in a way it wasn't 2 years ago." She looked at the spot. "That's going to be visible in the spring moisture readings. I've been waiting to see whether it showed up in the winter temperatures first." Dwight stood up and looked at the spot he had just measured. Then he looked at Nora. "I'm going to need to revise my estimate of how long this takes," he said. "What was your estimate?" 4 years minimum for measurable systemic change. Probably 6 for the kind of data that would satisfy a scientific review. And now, he looked at the pasture. 2 years was apparently enough to start. He paused. which means your timing was better than mine. She did not say anything to that because there was nothing useful to say to it, and because the thing that mattered was not who had been right about the timing, but what the timing had produced. The spring of 1997 came in with the particular decisiveness of a season that has been held back for a long time and is now releasing with accumulated pressure. The land responded to it the way the data had suggested it would, quickly and completely, the native grasses rising to their full height within weeks of the snowmelt. The big blue stem finding its pace and maintaining it through May and into June, without the faltering that drought conditions produced in the surrounding pastures. By June, the difference between the Callaway property and its neighbors was not a matter of interpretation. It was a matter of looking. You drove down the county road and you looked, and the difference was there on one side of the fence and the other green and not green, alive and struggling the land on the Callaway side, doing something that the land on the other side had forgotten how to do. People talked about it differently now. Not with the easy certainty of the first 2 years, when the certainty had been in the direction of Nora being wrong. Now the certainty was different still, forming, not yet settled into a new consensus, but moving. She heard it at the feed store in June, when she went in for supplies, and 2 ranchers she barely knew were discussing root depths and soil moisture in the specific terms she had used in her monitoring notebooks. The terms she had learned from Professor Wentworth's papers and from the research she had read in the university library. Terms that were now in circulation in the county in a way they had not been 3 years ago. She bought her supplies and drove home and went back to work. Cornelia Brandt's team was on the property through most of July. They were thorough and quiet and professional. The thoroughness of people who understood that the credibility of what they found depended on the quality of how they looked for it. Cornelia herself was on the property most days, moving through the pastures with the methodical attention of someone who was not going to stop until she was satisfied that she had seen everything there was to see. On the last Friday before the team was scheduled to leave, Nora found Cornelia standing in the northeast corner of the eastern pasture, the corner where everything had first started to change, where the probe readings in the summer of 1994 had first shown something different from the surrounding land, where the big blue stem had first appeared in numbers that meant something. Cornelia was not taking measurements. She was just standing there looking at the grass. Nora walked over and stood beside her. "My family's ranch in Nebraska," Cornelia said after a moment. "I drove past it 2 years ago. I hadn't been back since we sold it." She paused. "The new owners converted it to row crops, soybeans and corn. The grass is gone entirely." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was gone the way things that are gone, permanently." Nora waited. "The soil is still there," Cornelia said. "Compacted, degraded, but still there. The seed bank is still there. The native species don't disappear immediately from a place they grew in. They go dormant. They go underground. They wait." She looked at the big blue stem moving in the wind ahead of her. "What you've done here suggests that waiting is not the same as being gone." "No," Nora said. "It's not." Cornelia was quiet for another moment. "I'm going to recommend in my report that this site be designated as a reference location for future restoration work in the Great Plains region. That means researchers will want to come back, annually probably, for a long time." She looked at Nora. "I'm asking whether that would be acceptable." "Yes," Nora said. "That would be acceptable." Cornelia nodded. She looked at the grass one more time. "Professor Wentworth sent me a note when he heard I was coming out here," she said. "He said to tell you he was not surprised." Nora looked at the big blue stem, tall and strong, and doing exactly what a plant that had evolved over 15,000 years of Great Plains conditions knew how to do when the conditions finally allowed it. "Tell him I said the land remembered," she said. "Tell him he was right." The report went out in August, and what followed from it was the thing that happens when evidence accumulates past the point where it can be explained away, or ignored, or framed as an interesting anomaly. It becomes part of the story that a community tells about itself and what is possible within it. The story that Meade County began to tell in the autumn of 1997 was different from the story it had been telling in the spring of 1994. And the difference was not small. 14 ranchers asked about the monitoring protocol. 3 converted sections of their properties to rotational approaches. Oren Flagg's board began discussing a modified lending category for ecological restoration investments, the first such category the bank had considered in its history. Professor Wentworth published a paper that cited the Callaway data as one of 3 cases demonstrating sub-decade recovery timelines in severely degraded Great Plains prairie. Adeline Marsh's investigation piece about Agricor and Boyd Stanner ran in November, 3 weeks after the appraisal came in. The piece was careful and well documented and did not overreach what the evidence supported. It made clear what the pattern was without claiming more certainty about intent than the evidence warranted. Several ranchers who had been in conversation with Stanner's representatives in other counties called their conversations off after the piece ran. One family in Wyoming that had been considering an offer similar to the one made to the Callaways decided to look more carefully at the mineral rights clause they had been told was standard boilerplate. Nora read the piece at the kitchen table on the morning it ran and thought about the paragraph on page 7 of the contract that had been there in April of 1994, waiting to be noticed by someone who was reading for it. She thought about what would have happened if she had not come home when she did, if she had taken 2 more weeks and arrived to find a signed contract rather than an unsigned one. She thought about the sign at the end of the lane, white letters on red, a number that had not understood what it was measuring. The prairie outside the kitchen window was in its late autumn state, brown and gold, and the gray of dried grass, the color of the season it had earned. The bison were somewhere in the northern section, going about the business of being bison on the land where bison had always been before the fences, and after them, patient as the grass itself. She folded the newspaper and set it on the table beside her coffee and looked out the window for a moment longer. Then she put on her coat and went outside to check the east fence, because the east fence had been showing some wire fatigue near the second corner post, and the wire fatigue needed to be addressed before the first real snow came, and the first real snow was coming. She could smell it in the air this morning, a day away at most. She walked across the yard toward the east fence with her tools in one hand and the late autumn light on her back. And above her the sky was the particular blue of a Great Plains autumn morning that she had grown up under, and that she would grow old under. The sky that had always been above this land, and that would be above it long after every fence post in the county had been replaced and replaced again. The prairie was alive around her, beneath her feet, in the air she was breathing, doing the slow and patient work of being what it was, what it had always been, what it was going to continue to be. She reached the fence post, set her tools down, and got to work. There was a morning in the 3rd week of September of 1994, 6 months into the experiment that everyone in Meade County had decided was going to fail, when Nora Callaway almost gave up. She had not planned to nearly give up. The moment arrived without announcement, in the way that moments of genuine doubt tend to arrive not as a crisis, but as a quietly held truth that surfaces one morning in the particular quality of the early light. She was in the eastern pasture before sunrise, with Hatch making her weekly measurements, and she reached the 6th monitoring post and pushed her probe into the soil and wrote the number in her notebook, and then sat down in the grass and looked at the numbers from the past 6 weeks laid out on the page. The improvements were real. They were also small. 15% moisture retention at post 12, 8% at post 7, 6% at post 3. The grass was responding, but slowly, the way things respond when they have been damaged for a long time and are only now beginning to access the conditions that allow recovery. She had known this intellectually since she had read the research literature in the university library. She knew it in the specific, measured way that a person knows something they have read, but she had not known it in the embodied way that a person knows something they are living through. And there was a difference between the two that the research literature did not fully prepare you for. The bank deadline was October. The numbers she was sitting in the grass looking at were not October numbers. They were numbers for a process that needed more time than October was going to give her. Hatch put his chin on her knee. She put her hand on his head. She sat in the grass for a long time. Then she thought about her father's letter to Chester Ironwood, written 5 years before Harlan Calloway died, asking about bison and old grasses, and whether a ranch of this size could make the transition. He had never sent a second letter. He had gotten Chester's response and then gone quiet, and now Chester was sitting in the spare room of the ranch house after delivering 12 bison, and the spare room had been Harlan's spare room, and the land was Harlan's land. And the idea in the letter was Harlan's idea, and she was the person who was here to carry it forward because he had run out of time before he could trust it enough to begin. She thought about what it would have meant to him to never begin, to have seen it and understood it, and written the letter and then let it go because the timing was not right, or the certainty was not complete enough, or the debt felt too heavy to add to it. She thought about his notebooks in the barn, 30 years of observations, the handwriting she had known all her life, the record of a man who had watched this land every day and had seen something in it that he had not been able to act on. She stood up. She pushed her probe into the next monitoring post location and wrote the number in her notebook. Then she walked to the next one. That was the morning she understood what the work actually was. Not the land restoration, not the bison program, not the data or the monitoring or the meetings with Orange Flag. The work was this: to keep going past the morning when you nearly didn't, and to find out what was on the other side of that morning, and to keep finding out until the land showed you what it had been trying to show you all along. She kept going. The autumn of 1994 passed, and the winter came, and the spring of 1995 came behind it. And the data was building in the notebooks, and the bison were healthy, and the grass was coming back in the ways she had predicted. And the county inspection had found no violations, and Orange Flag's board had agreed to 8 more months, and she kept going. She kept going through the second summer, and the second autumn, in the second winter, through Dwight Sable's visits, and Harriet Voss's Tuesday evenings, and Adeline Marsh's article, and the tours that Winifred ran with the clipboard, and the rainfall records, and the particular confidence of a woman who had decided to stop being afraid of the numbers and start using them. She kept going through the county complaint, in the cut wire, in Boyd Stanner's silence, in Gary Dietz's tire impression in the soil, and the investigation that produced not charges, but documentation. She kept going through the spring of 1997 in Cornelia Brandt's skeptical eyes, and the third week of fieldwork, and the soil cores, and the core from the northeast corner that showed the dark, healthy earth extending deeper than anyone except Nora and Dwight had expected it to extend. She kept going until the land had enough time to show everyone what it had been showing her since the morning she sat down in the grass with the notebooks and chose to stand up again. The appraisal came in October, and the number was what the number was. And Winifred sat down when she read it, and Orange Flag called and came out to the kitchen table where so many conversations had happened, and Vic Prudhoe drove up the lane on a Saturday afternoon and said what he had come to say without decoration. And Chester Ironwood's letter arrived with a single paragraph about what the land remembered, and Winifred read it, and that evening cried the kind of tears she had been holding back for 3 years. And Nora Calloway stood on the ridge with her mother in the November light and looked at the bison moving through the big blue stem in the long gold of a late afternoon, in the year that everything became clear, and understood that the land she had come home to save had been saving her right back all along, through every hard morning and every measurement and every meeting and every season of watching the invisible become visible, giving her back something she had not known she needed until she had it, which was the certainty that her father had been right, that the land had not forgotten, that the patient and the persistent and the willing to wait were the ones the land rewarded, that what her father had seen and written to Chester about, and then set aside for lack of time, was now standing in the grass in front of her. 23 animals, and the prairie they had always belonged to, alive, alive, alive. She had not invented anything. She had not performed a miracle. She had simply trusted what she could not yet see, and kept trusting it past the mornings she nearly stopped, and done the work every day until the work was done. The wind moved across the grass. The light went down. The prairie breathed. The day Nora Calloway turned 27, which was in the second month of the year the appraisal came in, she walked the entire perimeter of the property alone. She had not planned to do this. She had woken earlier than usual, with the particular alertness that sometimes came at the end of a long effort, when the effort was no longer consuming all of her energy, and she had energy left over for things like noticing that she was a year older, and that the year she had turned 23 had been a year that changed everything that came after it. She put on her coat and her boots and went outside, and instead of going directly to the eastern pasture to check the monitoring posts, she walked the south fence line first. She had walked pieces of the perimeter many times. She had walked to specific posts to check specific repairs. She had walked sections while doing the early morning measurements, but she had not walked the whole boundary all at once since she had been a child, when her father used to walk it with her on Sunday mornings after the cattle were checked and the chores were done. He called it the weekly accounting, not because he was accounting for anything financial, but because he believed that a person who owned land owed it the attention of a full circumnavigation every few weeks so that you understood the whole of what you were responsible for, rather than only the parts that currently needed fixing. She walked it now in the light of a February morning, the cold clean and the sky beginning to go pink above the eastern ridge. Hatch moving more slowly than he once had, but still moving, still beside her in the way he had been beside her every morning for 3 years. The south fence ran along the county road. She walked it from the east corner to the west corner, checking posts in wire as she went, noting in the notebook she carried the 3 places where the wire had developed the kind of fatigue that needed to be addressed before spring. She reached the southwest corner and turned north along the west fence, the ridge rising on her right, the pastures opening on her left. The west fence ran along Vic Prudo's land. She walked it in the half-dark of early morning and could see across the fence line the difference between his south section and the land beyond it. The south section where he had begun the transition a year ago showed the beginning of the change, the native grass coming in where the conventional grass had been, not yet what the Calloway land was, but clearly moving in the same direction. The sections beyond it were still in their conventional state, the state that most of western South Dakota was still in. Grass that was shallower and more vulnerable, and that had been showing that vulnerability for 3 dry summers now. She turned east along the north fence at the top of the property and walked toward the sunrise. The bison were in the northern section this morning. She could see them in the half-light, large shapes, moving through the tall grass, unhurried, entirely themselves. She stopped for a moment and watched them. Hatch sat down beside her feet and watched them too. She thought about Chester Ironwood's first letter to her, written in response to the letter she had sent him in her final year at university. She had asked him whether he thought the restoration approach was viable for a property that had been under conventional cattle management for 30 years and was severely depleted by drought. His answer had been a single paragraph. He had written, "The land does not forget what it was. It only waits for the right conditions to return. The question is not whether it can come back. The question is whether the people responsible for it have the patience to wait long enough to see it happen." She had read that letter standing in the university library, and she had read it again on the night she arrived home and saw the "for sale" sign at the end of the lane. And she had read it again after the first meeting with Orrin Flagg. And she had read it again on the morning she sat down in the grass in September of 1994 with the small numbers in her notebook and nearly decided to stop. Each time she had read it, it had said something slightly different, because she was a slightly different person each time she read it, with slightly different information about what the patience he was describing actually required of you in practice. She turned south along the east fence, completing the circle, walking back toward the house with the sunrise ahead of her. The eastern pasture was on her right. The big blue stem was standing in the February cold, dormant now, but not gone. Its roots deep in the ground, holding everything it had gathered since April of 1994, waiting for the spring that was coming in 6 weeks to begin the season's growth again. She reached the starting point at the southeast corner of the south fence. She had walked the full perimeter. She had made the weekly accounting, as her father called it, not because anything was currently in crisis, but because the land was hers to be responsible for. And responsible meant the whole of it, not only the parts that needed fixing. She stood at the corner post for a moment and looked at the ranch from this angle, the full scope of it visible in the morning light, the pastures in the barn and the house and the fence lines, and the ridge and the bison in the northern section, and the prairie stretching out in every direction to where it met the sky. It was the same land she had looked at from the county road on the evening she came home, when it had been gray and exhausted and nearly lost. It was not the same land. Both things were true. It was the same 720 acres in the same county, under the same sky, and it was something completely different from what it had been. Because what something is depends not only on its location and its dimensions, but on the life it is supporting, and the life this land was supporting now was different from the life it had been supporting 3 years ago in every measurable way. Hatch walked to the corner post and sat down beside it and looked at her. She looked back at him. The white fur on his muzzle caught the morning light. "Come on," she said, and turned toward the house. She had soil samples to process, and a letter from Professor Wentworth to answer, and a phone call to return from the researcher who was planning to come out in March for the first of what Cornelia Brandt had described as the annual reference site visits that would continue for years. She had a fence post to replace in the south section, and a conversation to have with Winifred about whether to take Chester Ironwood's offer of 12 more animals in the spring. She had work to do. She walked toward the house in the February morning with the old dog beside her, in the prairie around her, and the land doing the slow and patient and inexhaustible work of being itself, the work it had been doing since before any fence or road or roof had been placed on it, the work it would be doing long after every fence and road and roof were gone, the work that did not need her permission and did not depend on her belief and did not stop or start based on whether anyone was watching. She was watching. She had always been watching. That was enough. That had always been enough. The house was warm when she pushed open the screen door. The smell of coffee and old wood and the dried prairie flowers in the clay jar near the window. Winifred was at the stove. Hatch walked to his mat beside it and lay down with the deliberate satisfaction of an animal returning to the warmest place in a cold morning. Nora hung her coat and took off her boots and sat down at the kitchen table. "Good walk?" Winifred asked. "Did the full perimeter?" Winifred turned from the stove and looked at her with the expression she sometimes wore when Nora did something that reminded her specifically of Harlan. Not a sad expression, not exactly, but one that contained both the sadness of the missing and the something else that comes alongside it when the person who is missing is present in the person who is there. "He would have done that today," Winifred said. Nora knew that. She had done it partly for that reason, though she would not have been able to say so clearly until this moment. "I know," she said. Winifred set a cup of coffee in front of her and went back to the stove. Outside the kitchen window, the February light was coming up fully now, the kind of cold, clean morning light that western South Dakota made in winter. The light that Nora had grown up under, and that she was going to grow old under, and that she was going to keep looking at every morning for as long as she was the person responsible for this land, and then hand off to whoever came after her the same light her father had looked at every morning for 30 years. The same light that fell now on the big blue stem and the bison and the dark, healthy earth that was holding the water that the prairie needed to be what it was. She picked up her coffee and looked out the window. The land was out there, being the land doing what the land did. She was in here being the person who got to watch it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.